Can everybody, that's it. Can you, that's it. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Great. So everybody can see that. If I just go through the map suddenly, we've got Anglesey, between Anglesey and the mainland, the Menai Strait. Yeah. Then the city of Bangor on the Menai Strait on the mainland side, and the town of Caernarfon to the south west of Bangor. If you then work inland, can you find bottom right Snowdon? And really, if you take a line from Caernarfon to Snowdon, that's about 10 miles. And in that 10 miles, obviously, you go from sea level to 3,500 feet. And that really gives you an idea of the nature of the area. If you, again, go to Caernarfon, go inland, and for the first sort of 4 miles or so, that land is relatively flat and relatively fertile. Then you get to a contour, a 500 feet contour, those dotted lines, and then you just come inland a bit further, and can you see the Padarn Ridge? And along the inside of that ridge, between Penygroes, Llanberis, Diniolen, Bethesda, all that is sort of slate, which is fairly near the surface, so it's slate that could be mined, and that so dictates the nature of the communities of this area. Moving land a little bit again, if you find the black dot Llanberis, the black dot above the B in Llanberis, can you just make out there's a lake that runs northwest from Llanberis, that's it. That's Llyn Padarn. Then a little bit to the right of that black dot above Llanberis is that shaded bit, which is the Dinorwig quarry. And that was one of the main slate quarries, employing at one time over 3,000 men. Then if you move north or northeast of it towards Bethesda, you can see another massive quarry, the Penryn quarry. If you move in the other direction, south west, following that Padarn Ridge, you get to Penygroes, and then another massive quarry and several smaller quarries in between. So I think that's what we need. You can also maybe just note the triangles, which indicate the mountains which are at 3,000 feet or above, and those run in a sort of line between Snowdon, Glydermawr, Carned Dafydd, and so on and so forth. What I'd love to do is to take you to a vantage point above Llanberis where you can see all this, and maybe one day we can do that. But in the meantime, if you could just use your imagination, and we'll talk a bit about one particular community, which is really the community of Dyffryn Peris, which runs down from Llanberis and includes Diniolen, that little area, more or less the area within that black continuous line, which is a bit like the shape of a revolver. That's more or less the community that we're talking about. But I want to make the point that we're talking about this particular community, but we're abstracting from it ideas which really relate to communities generally. And it's ultimately, this is about a way of thinking. So now I'm going to refer to the sheet on understanding community, the case study of Dyffryn Peris. I don't know, I thought that had so much material on it that it wouldn't work so well as a slide, but if you can put it up, that would be good.
Okay.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Brilliant. Case study of Dyffryn Peris. Now then, I want to start by sort of emphasizing, ultimately, I think this is a little lesson on philosophy. That's what we're actually going to be talking about ultimately. If you remember, when you go to secondary school, and I don't think it's changed since my days, the first thing you get is a timetable, and a timetable with squares or rectangles with different subjects in those rectangles. And then as you proceed through the education system, you tend to have fewer boxes, you look at fewer subjects, and if you go on to college or what have you, you end up looking at one sort of several fewer aspects of one or two subjects. What I'm sort of saying is the tendency is within the education system for us to learn more and more about less and less.
3 weeks.
Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So really, if to understand community, we think in a very different way. We think across subjects. We think in a way which sees the relationship between, in this case, Dyffryn Peris, there's a relationship between the geology, the geography, the ecology, the history, the economics, the sociology, the political, the cultural, linguistic. All these things, when you think of it in terms of a community, all these things are interrelated. So I'll just go quickly through some of the points. Why start with Ice Age effects? I suppose, just to put in perspective, that 10,000 years ago, nobody lived here because it was too cold. So in a sense, subsequently, in one sense, we're all immigrants at some point or other. The Arabon Plain is that bit which was a fertile land towards the coast. But at 3,000 feet or so, you've still got remnants of that Arctic period. Somebody found a spider at the top of Snowdon about 20 years ago, which is an Arctic spider. I make a sort of visit nearly every year to see the Snowdon lily, which is a remnant of the Arctic period, which grows in about 5 or 6 places high up on the cliffs, 3 or 4 mountains in Snowdonia. There's an Arctic char that lives deep in one of the lakes, or in a couple of the lakes. Okay, to the topography of the land, okay, obviously high mountains, etc. Thirdly, the Snowdon Forest. There is near Llanberis, on the opposite side of the lake, a small sessile oak nature reserve of Arthwen, and that in a way gives you an idea of what the natural vegetation of the area was at one time and would be were it not for the fact of man's interference, mainly agriculture, mainly sheep. If we start and look quickly at the sort of a bit of the history, there are round hut remains, lots of them to be seen of late Stone Age on Iron Age. 5 Celtic hill forts, there are 3 distinct ones which guard the upper part of the valley. You move to the Roman period, and through the valley, the Roman road went from the Roman road called San Helen went from Caernarfon all the way to South Wales. In a way, it was quite a sort of progressive system of communication. Imagine it a bit like a Y in the north and then an inverted Y in the south. So you have this sort of midriff going through Wales and then separating one branch towards Carmarthen and one towards Caerleon in the south, and in the north the Y, one towards Caernarfon and one towards northeast Wales. Some people argue that's been a better communication system than we've had since. Certainly those of us who are used to the A470 might still envy San Helen. The Roman route, they probably came and excavated copper, certainly in part of Snowdonia. You begin to ask questions about the nature of empires. Copper was important, and there were plentiful supplies of copper, lead, silver, even a bit of gold in Wales. You ask the question, why did the Romans not bother with Ireland? And part of the answer is there weren't any known mineral deposits in Ireland. Can you see that if you generalize, you ask then questions about later empires? Why do empires take over bits of the world? Why are people involved in oil areas today, and so on and so forth? Number 7, before 1282, a long period of struggle between the native Welsh people and Normans and people that came from the east. Ultimately, the conquest in 1282. Before we romanticize too much about some of the Welsh princes. Llywelyn Fawr actually imprisoned his brother Owain in Dolbadan Castle in Peris. He was imprisoned there for 21 years and allegedly fell to his death attempting to escape. I say allegedly. Then you've got Caernarfon Castle, which is part of the Norman wing of castles, which enforced the conquest of Wales after 1282. Number 8, the Bainol estate. If you go back on the map, there is a sort of a shield. Well, refer to it. Don't go back to it now, but refer to it later. On the main ice straits, there's a shield-shaped Bainol mark. That is the headquarters of the Bainol estate. There's a 7-mile wall surrounding the estate, keeping the peasants in and keeping the peasants out, as somebody said. You had 3 major estates in the area: the Bainol estate, the Penrhyn estate, and the Gwynllifon estates. And basically, these people owned virtually all the fertile land of the lowland. You had tenant farmers, which paid rent to these people, but these people were immensely wealthy. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, these were the people that the vote. They were the representatives in Parliament. They were the representatives locally, the justice system, and they were the people that call in the soldiers at any time. This was never a popular sort of system, as the Owain Glyndŵr uprising tells you, and again, the Llanberis area was important as part of that uprising. Number 10, the Enclosure of Common land. If you think about, visualize the map, that lowland was already privatized, owned by the 3 large estates. But the land above 500 feet was virtually all common land. And on that common land, people did sort of scrape a living. It was less fertile land, but you could just about survive it. And there was a tradition of doing things in a particular way. Material like tiny-nost, the houses that you could build in one night that allowed you to have a house and a space on the common land. But throughout Wales, in that period from about 1770 to about 1850, about a third of the land which had been common land was now privatized. It was the land, the more marginal land, the mountain land, the marshland, and what have you. But that became really important in an area like this. There was a Land Enclosure Act for a particular parish. That went through Parliament. Who was the representative in Parliament? He was the head of the Bainol estate. And in that way, that common land became the private ownership of the Bainol estate. The ordinary people resisted it. The local magistrates, under the direction of the Bainol estate, called in the military. Scottish Highlanders were garrisoned in Llanrug for 11 months. People were imprisoned. Some people were transported to Australia, what have you. But ultimately, this land was privatized and settled. What's important about it, number 11, was these people that had lived on the common land were now given the right to become smallholders of upland, but they then had to pay rent to the Bainol estate. They could hardly produce enough food themselves, but certainly they couldn't produce a surplus which would give them money to pay rent. So these people really, in order to be able to pay rent, had to sell something. And the thing that they had to sell was their labor. And those people became a working class, a working men mainly, and they worked in the quarries which were developing at the same time. Quarries that now, because of the Enclosure of Common land, the land became the private ownership of the Bainol estate, but also the underlying rock became the private ownership. So that in one sort of foul swoop, by enclosing the common land, you turned what you can think of as a peasantry into a sort of proletariat, into a people who sold their labor. And if you think of this in miniature in this particular community, then that's a process that's happened all across the world. To understand what's happened in the last 100 years in Asia, Africa, Latin America, across the world, you have this sort of process where a peasantry becomes a proletariat. Usually that means also urbanization, that people move from rural areas to urban areas. But in this case, the development happened within one place. 12 migration. There had been copper mining prior to the development of slate in the first half of the 19th century. And workers came from Cornwall and Yorkshire, and you still have Cornish surnames, Fleming and Closs, still common in the area. The slate quarrymen, they came from surrounding areas in northwest Wales mainly, and they came because there was a push and a pull. There was a pull towards this new way of living where you could sell your labour, but also there was a push out of the rural areas because land was being enclosed in other rural areas. Pushed off the land. If you look at the table, it really tells the whole story of the relationship between the population and the number of people working in, particularly the Dinorwig quarry, which is the largest quarry in the area. Small to start with. By 1820, the Vaynol estate had taken it over. Prior to that, individuals or groups of men were quarrying slate, surface slate. But by 1820, the land had been privatised in the Enclosure Acts, and capital had moved in to develop the quarries under the ownership of the Vaynol estate. So things then grew rapidly, people drawn in, 800 people, 1848, 2,000 people, 1876, 3,000 people, booms and slumps throughout this sort of period. But really, for most of the slate quarrying areas, the story is of growth during the 19th century and decline during the 20th century, but still important up to 1960s. But you in South Wales with the story of coal, in many respects, there are so many similarities. Slate, in 1900, there were actually more people working on slate in Wales than were working on coal. But obviously later, coal developed and developed at even greater scale. But the process of deindustrialization, which has happened with slate, happens a bit later with coal. If we move to 13, which I think is on the next page, and migration worldwide, people, people talk of globalization now, but really the slate industry was a globalized or an international economy. Ships were built in places like the Narvon and Porthmadog, and those ships took slate all over the world, as far as New Zealand, States, Brazil. You find people, you find a story of slate. 13. Again, if we abstract from this, it will tell us the nature of capitalism. Really, we went from a period prior to industrialization, prior to the growth of the slate industry, some sort of feudalism. But really what happens with the development of slate is the ownership of land and capital. The Vaynol, Penrhyn and Newbury estates, they'd made fortunes out of the ownership of land, and land was the source of wealth prior to the Industrial Revolution. Then you needed capital. And where did that capital come from? If you can think of capital as a bag of money at its simplest. Okay, those estates had money because they were extracting rent from their ownership of land. Later, they started to make money out of being merchants. For example, the Penrhyn estate, they were involved in copper. They were involved, not so much in copper extraction, but in producing copper goods. They had ownership of the docks in Liverpool. They were part of the sort of golden triangle of British imperialism of that period. Their ships went from Liverpool to Africa carrying copper goods, from Africa to the Caribbean carrying slaves, and from the Caribbean back to Liverpool carrying sugar. and out of that they were extracting huge profits. That profit then was invested in the slate industry, and the slate industry for a long time was extremely profitable. One of my relatives worked in the Penryn quarry. We tried to work out what was the rate of profit that was made in the Penryn quarry, for example. And at the height of the industry, towards the end of the 19th century, more or less 3,000 workers, the wage bill for 3,000 workers was equal to the profit of Lord Penryn, who owned the quarry. That is, my relatives would have worked 5 hours and would have earned their wages in 5 hours. The other 5 hours, that worker would have been providing profit for Lord Penryn. But the same would be true for 3,000 workers. So within this industrial capitalism, number 14, you had huge struggles between capital and labour. In the Dinorwig quarry in 1874, the men were trying to create a trade union. Ashton Smith of the Vale Estate gave them an ultimatum: your job or the trade union. If you were part of the trade union, they were locked out. They met at one of the few places that hadn't been taken over through the Land Enclosure Act, and it's known today as Craiger in Dyffryn Trade Union Block. They met there, and a huge gathering of quarrymen, and 2,200 chose to stay with the union, and they were locked out. They did the same thing again in 1885. They were locked out for 8 months. They were starved back eventually in 1885 over the principle of an independent trade union. Massively, the same thing happened in Bethesda, in the Penryn quarry. But the longest industrial dispute in the history of the world, over 3 years, when those quarrymen were locked out for, as I said, 3 years. Huge solidarity support from coal workers across Wales, particularly South Wales, but also I've seen the record of one collection of £25 worth of farthings collected amongst East End of London tailor workers, people working in the rag trade. And £25 in farthings is a lot of people. 15, within understanding any community, the role of the state, the relationship between community and the state. And I want to look at that later on. It's particularly important today in understanding not only the whole ideas about community, but also where the power lies. And vitally important, at the end of this period of this virus period, there's going to be a huge bill today, and the struggle between community and state is going to be absolutely vital. And it's time that we prepare for that as soon as possible. 16, living conditions. We're used to really awful working conditions in the early part of construction. 17, transport develops. Slate and copper were carried on lakes to start with, then roads are built, narrow gauge railways, then full gauge railways. 18, people would sort of argue, well, all these owners of the quarries and the owners of all the land, they were hugely wealthy, what have you, but they were quite kind, or they could be quite kind. And quite often the wives would be involved in good works. They would provide schools, or they would contribute to schools, contribute to churches, and to silver bands. They would buy the instruments for the silver bands. But it is very much a paternalistic relationship. If the men went on strike, they had to hand back the instruments of the silver bands, for example. It shows where the power relationship really was. In understanding any community, number 19, religion, like the 6th century, 6th century sort of early sort of Celtic Christianity sells. Later you have the sort of established church, state church, the Church of England, parish churches. Then a huge struggle between established church and non-conformity. Certainly by 1780, established, and really most of the quarrymen were nonconformist in religion, radical in their politics, and caring as far as the community was concerned. Any sort of understanding of community, there's this relationship between religion and individual. In this case, it would be Christianity and individual, and Christianity and community. Is Christianity primarily about individual souls, or is it about some sort of social gospel? Whatever one thinks of religion, these are real questions within the story of religion. 20 culture, as with any community, there are aspects of culture, in this particular case, some of the Welsh language poetry, some of the prose of people like Selwyn Williams and Peris, reflected the nature of experience of the community with the behaviour of the quarries. I think it's Selwyn Williams that made me a socialist when I was very, very young, when I read one of his first novels, which was really about the story of the 1900 to 1903 lockout of the Perlin quarry. We move towards the present. Certainly after the Second World War, decline of Slate and decline of agriculture, those were really the fundamental building blocks of the economy of this part of the world. Those two declined. In their place came growth of the private service sector, particularly tourism. But if you look at tourism, and if you make an analysis of that tourism, you've got Snowdonia Caravan Park, it's just House 40, large conglomerates own 80, maybe 85% of the tourist industry of these areas, and certainly the cream of the profit of the tourist industry is extracted out of the area. 22, Dinorwig Pump Storage Station. The Dinorwig Quarry is now a pump storage station owned by a French multinational, Engie. It's hugely profitable, incredibly profitable, producing electricity in this particular way. I could tell the whole story of this, the way in which McAlpine actually bought the whole quarry for allegedly £19,000 in 1964, made a huge profit in building the pump storage scheme, being the provider of all the cement, the gravel, the sand, and what have you. Somebody one day must write the story of McAlpine in Wales. People forget that McAlpine offered, when Wales voted for devolution, McAlpine offered to provide the housing for the assembly, but that was declined. But what's interesting is why McAlpine thought it important at the time to have their name on the Welsh assembly. 23, capital labour today. Well, labour is, as happens all across the world, capital is globalized increasingly. So although Friction Dynamics is now closed, but it was purchased then in the US multinational producing car parts. Just House 40 owns most of the hotels, caravan parks, and what have you. Engie owns the electricity producing stations. Euro DPC produces medical kits. Grosvenor Investments owns the railway that runs to the top of Snowdon. Huge ownership of land and what have you. So you've got local capital, and then you've got predominantly transnational capital, and this is the story across the world. Changes in the workforce. We've seen a decline in the primary sector, that is agriculture and Slate, and growth in the services sector, both private and public. The public sector is so important in this part of the world. Any sort of decline in the public sector so heavily affects our communities. The private sector is mainly tourism, and that's seasonal, but it is possible to work on the private sector or to work on the tourist sector and make it into a community tourism, which is one of the things that we're trying to do. Huge change in the situation of women with this change in the economic base. Slate and agriculture, particularly Slate, you had 3,000 quarrymen, for example, in the Norway quarry, and 3 women. The 3 women worked in the quarry hospital, one as a matron and 2 nurses, and that was it. And so much of the story of Wales is about a very sort of male-dominated history and quite a macho society. That has changed considerably since, since the Second World War, but increasingly since the 1960s. So nearly half the workforce in this part of the world, as is the case throughout Wales, are now women, but they're still paid less, and they do work fewer hours for less. Well, they paid work less, but the amount of work they do, paid and unpaid, most measurements show that they do far more than men on average. 24. I'm coming towards the end of this sort of rather sort of quick sort of look at one community. This community is unique, and that's the case for any community in the world. But the way in which factors interacted to create this specific community worked in a similar way to form communities in other parts of Wales, Europe, and across the world. What I'm saying is, if you understand your own community, and if you abstract from it, get away from the parochial local history, but look at the history of our own communities and look at it more in general terms and the way that we can abstract from that story and then understand other communities. We could look at theories of capitalist development and even development. We could look at community and regional development today, which we will do, I think, later. Just to finish, 25. What I want you to get out of all this is a way of thinking. And that way of thinking, I think, can be summed up with 3 words. Integrated. That is, it's been a bit ridiculous, really, but we've touched on geology, geography, history, virtually every sort of subject under the sun, to try and sort of outline this community. But basically, communities only make sense if we see the relationship between things, between the economy and the culture, between the environment and the economy. And really, this is a different way of thinking, and I would argue this is a far more advanced way of thinking. That the problem for a lot of the world, and it's summed up beautifully by a Welsh poet called Selwyn Williams, he describes, in Welsh he says, rhag yr hemp sydd I lawr nad elfennwr ac ill never serve rhydd. If I roughly translate that, save us from the disaster that lies to the hand of the reductionist who loses between his fingers the world. And this is part of the sort of problem of the dominant culture, that it separates environment and economy. It separates the social and the cultural. When in fact, for us that think in terms of community, then we don't see that these are in silos. Part of the problem for the state is that, and we see it with local government, with central government, that they work operate in silos, that this sort of division of labour, their heads, but also in practice, means that they can't really form policies and ways of working which really measure up to what community development should be. So that integrated thinking. The second word, eclectic, or you could use holistic. That is, we've tried to look at this as an entirety. It's a bit ridiculous. In what is half an hour, we've gone from the Ice Age to the present, looking at all sorts of different aspects. But the detail isn't important. What's important is that we see the shape of the forest, that we think of things in their entirety. I think there's a Russian expression, the task of the bourgeois academic is to hide the forest behind the trees. That is, the world only makes sense if you can see the entirety. That's not an argument against specialisms, but the ideal would be a sort of education that would allow us to be able to see the shape of the forest, be able to specialize maybe in the bark of one tree, but be able to see the bark of that tree always in the context of the bigger picture of the forest. And that's why we need education which needs to be different, an education for community by community. Eclectic to look at it as a whole. And the third word is dialectical. You could spend a whole term talking about this, but dialectical is basically that things are debatable the whole time, that there's tension between things. We've touched on in the history of this area, the tension between capital and labour, the ownership of the quarries and the people working in the quarries. But everywhere there are tensions. There's tension today between state and community. That's a really important one for us to understand. And you can look at tension negatively, but also you can look at it positively. And I think that's what we have to do as community developers, is to look at the tension between things and look at the ways in which that tension can result in progress, to use that tension for progress. Without tension, there's no change. So we have to welcome that tension, but the art is to turn that into a positive thing. So I hope you get out of this some sort of way of thinking which is integrated, eclectic and dialectical. I hope that makes some sort of sense. If you apply that sort of framework of understanding to your own communities, maybe you find that useful. I hope that's made some sort of sense to everybody. Thanks for listening anyway.
Thanks. I thought it was really very, very interesting. I hope everyone else enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Found it helpful.
Absolutely.
Great. Brilliant. Excellent.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah.
Really helpful. Really helpful.
And as Sal says, I think it would be amazing if everyone could go to Peris and have a look, go out there. Maybe when this is over, it'd be a good trip.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll definitely say we will do that.
Yeah.
I'd really love that. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask how far away is Cwmni Ffestiniog to this map?
As a crow flies, 25 miles.
Southeast?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I also sort of recognise that as a big Slate area. Am I right?
Yes.
The three community.
The different colours, the better.
Oh, start something now.
Always a tradition of rubbish in other people's slates.
Diolch yn fawr, Selwyn.
Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to raise about what Selwyn's been saying, particularly perhaps in relation to their communities and understanding their communities?
Well,
I was wondering, I started thinking about how I've kind of grown up here forever, and I probably don't know as much about my own area that I've grown up as you've been able to tell us just now about your community. And I was just wondering, where would you start? Where would be a good place to start to dig up some of that, the history, to kind of understand the changes over time? Where would a novice newbie start to find out and investigate to try and build up our local picture too?
That's a really important point, and we were aware of this. And years ago, within the Dyffryn Peris area, we tried to, we started, we brought the 6 primary schools and the secondary school together, and we created a curriculum, a community curriculum, so that the idea was that everybody that left school would have gone through some sort of understanding of their own community in the sort of way that we're talking about this morning. And that was such a pleasure. I taught a primary school class in Diniolen for a bit. And I was telling them in Diniolen, because Diniolen was at the heart of the struggle between the people that lived on the common land and the soldiers that came to drive them off the common land. And I was telling the children about this. And the following day, one of the children's grandfather came to the school, and he was quite sort of shy about the whole thing. And he took me to one side, and in a huge sort of paper bag, he took out a pastel, what's a pastel in English? A club that his great-grandfather had taken off the soldiers in a skirmish in 1807 or 1808 or something. And he'd hidden it it had been hidden by his family in the Crogloft. And he was still a bit scared whether the authorities would persecute them for having taken this off the soldiers. But why I'm saying all that is there's a wealth of history within our community. If we could find a way of actually bringing that out, we have in Ffestiniog, we've run courses on Cynefin and community. Cynefin is that lovely Welsh word about everything about the local area, including the sort of environment as well as the people. And, there's so much we can do in that way. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question directly, but where do you live?
Neil Andrindod.
Okay,
Andrindod.
yeah, okay.
So I know about this. A lot of it is like the town springing up from the spas. So I think a lot of people know about that, and the market towns and agriculture and things like that. But there's just so much more detail that you were able to share today that there's like, you know, before that.
Yeah, there was a drama in Welsh, they've done the 5 days of freedom about Llandrindod, and that was about the woolen workers and the way that they struggled. And they were similarly repressed and their sort of strike suppressed by the military. This was certainly in Llandrindod in the beginning of the 1830s, 1840s or so. But it's a tragedy, you know, the history that we taught in school. I went to school in the Cwmni Valley. I heard nothing about my own community, about my own valley at all, and things still haven't changed. But maybe this is something we just have to do ourselves outside the state system. We just have to develop our own community education.
I was interested in, you know, the San Helen.
Oh yes,
the Roman Road.
Yes.
In Banwen, the workshop is on the Roman Road, San Helen, because we named our cafes the San Helen Cafe.
Oh, is it really? I didn't know that at all. Yeah. Okay.
So when I give my bit of talk on May the 1st, I will give you a brief history of our area and how the Romans came here.
Right. Okay.
How St. Patrick was born in Banwen. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
So I can give you a brief history on that. So
yeah, that's one other link again. Yeah, there are so many links between North and South Wales that people don't realise how much slate quarry workers, when there was depression in the slate industry, how they would move to South Wales, backwards and forwards between North and South Wales. So many sort of connections.
Yeah. Okay.
I look forward to that. Okay.
Yeah. We walk, you start one end and I start the other, and we meet in the
well, I was thinking that I've walked a lot of San Helen from Cynefin, from Caernarfon, down to Tawscoed in mid Wales. But it's the second half, we could do that. Okay. I look forward to that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
We could do a Llechi Gwlad, Chefn Gwlad sponsored walk draws Cymru.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
Along San Helen. Yeah.
It'd be lovely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. If there are no other questions, although we will now expect a bit of history in each of the presentations that we have.
Looks like we lost Sarah for a moment.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Mid-flow. Let's see if she's on the chat. Just message her. Whilst we're waiting for Sarah to come back, oh, she's gone. She might be back in a mo. I will be pressing the stop record, obviously, when we finish. It takes about half an hour for the laptop to process it, and it'll be a huge, humongous file, but I can share it with you through one of the file sharing sites, both in video and audio. If you want to look at the, I don't know who was it, Gwentley said we like the Partridge Family. You sort of, it is. Yeah. See, so you have to be a certain age actually to remember that, but it's really quite amusing watching everyone as it must be the other way around. But diolch yn fawr iawn, Selwyn, oedd yn ddiddorol iawn. It was very, very interesting. I tempting another hour's debate. I'd be really interested in a longer discussion about particularity and generalization and objectivity, which philosophically is impossible, and how you understand places by standing back, whether that's assuming a certain colonialism and an imperialism in and of itself. But we'll save that. I can see Duncan smiling there because he's already writing a thesis on it for us. But sometimes I think there's a sort of a how you stand back and what do you do when you stand back is one of my sort of questions in that. I'm guessing Sarah's not going to make it back, so as the people work holder of this conference, I think probably we need to, unless there's anything else to say, draw a line. I know that a couple of people had to go early anyway, and that if it's okay with everyone else, we'll reconvene at the same sort of time. We'll issue the same invite. I know the Llechi a Chefn Gwlad group are meeting tomorrow morning at 11. We're not taking any notes as to who turns up first or last, obviously, but we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So without further ado, Pob hwyl, da bo chi.
Sel. Oh, my Sel di mynd. Yeah, I'll say it's English. I'm still going up periodically up the mountain to see if I can see a mapping of from the Manod to see Traws
Okay.
so we have a visual of our thing as well. But every time I go up it's a bit hazy. So soon.
Okay.
So rhaid rhannu hwnna fe chi cyn by hir.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Dim o fawr. Ta-ra.
Ta-ra.